for a number of sessions this week, and this public lecture on the topic of revisionism or conservatism in the Russian approach to global order, introducing the notion of the recovering power. So I'm looking very much forward to this. Igor has offered you, his dear audience, the following deal. He's going to speak more or less uninterrupted for 30 minutes, and then after having concluded his talks, he's going to open up to the audience for questions and discussion. So we'll see if we can let him get through those first 30 minutes without starting an argument, and then we can fight afterwards. So thank you very much, Igor.
Thank you so much. It is great pleasure to be here, and it is great pleasure to be part of this absolutely amazing consortium, and it is great pleasure to be here in Harvard, in this very place of where thoughts and research are flourishing. I'm well known among the students who are here as going overtime, but I'll try to avoid this in this important on this important occasion. So the topic actually that I'm going to speak about today is the one that I started to think about, and actually I had some trials of, on the same topic even before Mr. Trump generated his national security strategy in the late 2017. So to some extent it preceded much of the talk, which is now obviously everywhere, about different types of powers, about revisionist powers, about the non-revisionist powers, what it is and where we could find them. And I will try to talk in this context about the issues of global order, international institutions, and major powers. And I will try to first demonstrate that there is a certain pattern of viewing Russia in the international discourse. I have to say I should be rather either very brave or very stupid as a Russian, speaking about the US literature on Russian relations to the West in terms of the global order. Then I will try to show why and how it is wrong. Then, following the introduction, I have to say why it is not completely wrong. And then I will need to find some way ahead, right? And I try to be as much provocative as I can be, so that to generate a lot of questions and criticism on my side. So, I mean, of course, initially when I was thinking about this idea in 2017 and I was presenting on this, I wasn't talking about revisionist power, but there was already by that time a lot of discussion about the emerging powers. And from my perspective, if we talk about the specific notions, there is not necessarily, strictly speaking, a correlation. So the state could emerge, but not looking for the revision in the international system. But in the current context, I would say these terms are used very much as interchangeable. The only thing is that those who view the current developments in the international system as negative, they would use the later term, the one which appears in the national security strategy of the United States. And those who are less predisposed to see this, to use this in the negative development, they will talk that there is a rise of emerging powers, that there are new states coming to international stage, and they are playing a much greater role. I would also point to one important issue that actually the term revisionist power is not new to the international system and to the international discussions. You know, the division of, if you look at the Carr's classical book on 20 years crisis, there you could find status quo and revisionist powers. But I think we have today a very different notion of what does it mean to be an emerging power or to be a revisionist power. Because the talk is not today is not so much about territorial aggrandizement, rather than an ability to shape international environment, to shape international institutions, norms of the games in global politics, and in economic cooperation. Therefore, I will need to focus on this dimension, and there I will put the notion of powers, or Russia as a power, in the global order. Specifically, I could quote from the US national security strategy that I've mentioned several times. It says that China and Russia want to shape a world antithetical to US values and interests, and that's why they are proclaimed by the US as this kind of revisionists. It is not the only document where we could see this. In other contexts, on several times, Russia was accused of revisionism in expert circles, and also by some official pronouncement by some individual officials, and even more so in the expert community. It is claimed to be one of the states, usually together with China, which doesn't support the existing order and moreover wants to overthrow it. And these desires, these intentions are very much connected to the representation that Russia is criticizing the US which is presented in the Western discourse as the general architect of this international order. And I would say that there is some criticism of this position, that Russia and China are revisionist power, but especially Russia is a revisionist power. But it usually comes only from one circle. This is the criticism from those who say that Russia is not a revisionist power and couldn't be a revisionist power because of because it's not capable to be a revisionist power. So those who believe in Russian decline claim, and I think this is something which was brought up several times during the previous talks during this week, they claim that Russia maybe have intention to revise the existing institutions and rules, but it doesn't have enough power, capabilities, economic resources to do so. And even it doesn't have power to attempt to do so. So it cannot even be failed revisions. But that's basically it. That's basically, in the terms of discourse, what we see about how Russia is positioned. I would rather present a more nuanced critique to the dominant discourse and its representation in such a grandeur document as the US National Security Strategy. But to do that, for me, it is important to go beyond the very simple and misleading dichotomy that is very often used in the public discourse and now in the official documents. The dichotomy in some, I already said, in some areas it is the dichotomy between dominant and emerging powers. In other circles it is the dichotomy between status quo and revisionist power. Because in my sense, Russia doesn't fit in either category. And actually it represents a much more ambivalent and dialectic, if we take the traditional Marxist terms, position in the international politics. I think we need to think about Russia, and to capture this ambiguous position of Russia, we need to think about Russia as a restoring or recovering power. And I would claim that this definition is not just a kind of notions game. It's just not about joking with different words, just for the sake of intellectual sophistication, showing that you are such an intellectual person. But we need this notion to present more clearly the very particular position in international politics, which puts Russia in the category of its own, unlike the emerging revisionist and dominant traditional powers. So in what sense Russian position is different? Those who write extensively now about the global order, and they usually talk about the liberal order, they often fail to appreciate the foundations of the existing order emerged after the Second World War and developed through several decades since that moment. And through much of this time, the Soviet Union was active co-creator of the current order. Sometimes, and I would claim often, but that's already too provocative, on parity with the United States. So, of course, most important contribution was that it was co-founder of the United Nations and foundations of the current international law. Therefore, as you know, for example, Russia today enjoys privileged position as the UN Security Council permanent member. But apart from this overall UN architecture, we could name quite a number of institutions, regimes, which were co-created by the Soviet Union and the United States cooperatively, together with other states, of course, but with clear understanding that at that point in time there were two superpowers in the world. For example, non-proliferation regime, which was also co-produced, or international law of the seas. You of course know that the United States is not even now the member of the UNCLOS, unlike Russia, but Soviet Union was very much engaged in this process. Or even international pacts on human rights. You know, we have two pacts on human rights in the context of the UN. So Soviet Union was always already there, co-creator of these institutions, which are really fundamental for the current international order. And if you look at the Russian rhetoric, if you look at the Russian discourse, official discourse, you will see that it is very much in there, this pressure on the importance of these international institutions. So the most important document on Russian foreign policy, which we update from time to time, is the concept of the Russian foreign policy. It's a rough analog to some extent of the US national security strategy. And since 2000, in every concept of the Russian foreign policy, it is reiterated and acknowledged the central role of the UN and international law in the global system, and it put as the first part, is the first priority for Russia to strengthen this role, to enhance this role. I would also could also quote a section from one of the annual speeches by the Russian president. You know, we have this annual conference in Valdai, which is quite popular among the foreign academics as well. And this is the time where Mr. Putin delivers his traditional, very important speech. So in 2016, I believe, he said that today it is the United Nations that continues to remain an agency that is unparalleled in representatives and universality, a unique venue for equitable dialogue. Its universal rules are necessary for including as many countries as possible in economic and humanitarian integration, guaranteeing their political responsibility and working to coordinate their action, while also preserving their sovereignty and development models. And he also mentions that we have no doubt that sovereignty is the central notion of the entire system of international relations. So, if anything, with this kind of speeches, and I could provide more of the factual documents, but I promise to be brief, so I won't bother you with long citations anymore, don't worry. If anything, you could see more conservatism in Russian position and Russian approach to UN and international law. For example, for this issue like sovereignty, which some states say should be conditional, and Russia says that in accordance with the traditional position, it should be unconditional to most extent. And we have also other representations more specific, for example, Russian position on the veto power of the UN Permanent Security Council members, where it is much more conservative than some other players. So why does Russia adhere so much to these institutions? It could, from my perspective, it could be easily explained from the structural point of view. And we had, during also previous discussion, a lot of debate, structural, systemic explanation. But I will use here a very simple structural explanation. Because during the bipolar period, Moscow had mostly to negotiate these regimes primarily with the one state, the United States. And from time to time, it could do it even from the position of equality, and sometimes even from the predominant position on some issues. However, today, what we are seeing with the rise of the new emerging powers, and we could now further debate where they are, who are they, what is the specific list, but most of the scholars speak about China, about India. Some speak about the EU as a collective power of the international system. So all these players which come to international politics with more capabilities, with more opportunities to affect international system, they have their own claim regarding how the international institutions should be shaped and structured. Therefore, it is understandable that under the current condition, Russia will have less ability to affect international norms and rules than the Soviet Union had. And frankly speaking, this is the same situation for the United States, because the United States also have to take into account the position of many more members, and the new institutions that will be created will less reflect the institutes of both Russia and the United States. Why then the Russian position sometimes appear to be revisionist, and existing discourse on Russian revisionism exist? Is it completely out of touch with the reality? As I promised to tell you, it is not. It has some connections with the reality from my perspective, and I would provide two reasons. One of them is structural sins, and the other is strategic. So once again, I'm coming back to this notion of the recovering power, because as I said, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was actively engaged in the creating rules of the games and institutions that we all use even today, but it was not the case in the 90s and in 2000s. And frankly speaking, from the Russian position during this period where the US and their allies could dominate in the international system, they created new rules of the game, often without viewing Russian interests into consideration, and sometimes at the expense of the Russian interest. And so some of these institutions are the ones that Russia feels uncomfortable with. And so we could say that on the balance, there are institutions in the international system that Russia doesn't very much like. But we also need to acknowledge that not many of these institutions were formalized during this period of 1990s and 2000s. And to some extent, that was the own kind of approach of the United States and their allies. Because even in the 90s, they were not, when they were at the peak of their opportunities, they not often were eager to form legal institutions. They were not always able to do it because still Russia, China, some other states had different positions and pushed back on their claims, for example, regarding humanitarian interventions, which was not accepted as the legal right. So many of these institutions still, which are called now the Western institutions, the institutions of the Western liberal order, they continue to remain, despite the U.S. push in the 90s and 2000s, in some kind of gray area. They are not formally approved within the UN necessarily. The one major exception from this overall limitation is, of course, NATO and NATO enlargement, and that's why we see that Russia is pushing back so much on NATO as an institution, because it is the one single most obvious representation of for Russia, or when it was taken for granted and its voice wasn't heard. Once again, I do not try to claim whether it was right or wrong and who was right. We could engage in this debate fiercely during Q&A. Apart from this, there is another strategic consideration regarding Russian position to the existing institutions, and maybe why Russia would like to engage in reforming some of them. This is consideration which is also present here in the United States, as Russia, similar to the United States, understands that whatever its wishes are, whatever its activities will be, the rising powers will continue to rise. So one of the solutions to this process, which of course affects Russian interests as well as it affects American interests, is to try to move early, to try to accommodate these interests of the new rising powers, and to have a better bargaining while they are still in the process of the rise, until they get stronger positions in the international system and will be able to proclaim their claims even more authoritatively. I would say that Russia moved in this direction earlier than the United States. Maybe some of you remember that the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Primakov, already in the 1990s proposed this triangular cooperation between Russia, China, and India. It didn't work well at that point in time, but in the 2000s we had BRICS as a kind of forum for these countries with very diverse agendas to come together and to try to settle down their differences. And then it emerged into the BRICS. And in the context of BRICS, I would say that, for example, Russia embraced the idea which was put forward by these rising powers about the reform of international financial institutions, which, frankly speaking, from the position of the Russian interests, wouldn't be much of the priority. But Russia settled on this and accommodated this requirement. And on the other hand, it made sure that, for example, in the BRICS format, there is always reiteration about the central importance of the UN. And despite, for example, the Indian inconvenience that it is not still a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and we don't know whether it will be, so I didn't need to say the word still, but it is not. The BRICS and India continues to adhere in this sense to the UN institutions. So there is this idea strategic that you need to go into this accommodation, and the earlier you get to this accommodation, the more cooperative and the easier it will be. And I would say that with some of these countries, the US tried and continues to try to do the same. So to wrap up, and as I promised, with some maybe two optimistic views of how this all picture that I presented regarding Russia as a restoring power, regarding this problem of accommodation of the rising powers, how I view Russian-American relations in this regard. I think the notion of recovering power is very much important to substantially reassess the relations between Russia and the US. Because unlike 1990s and 2000s, and maybe people like William Wolford won't agree with me completely, but even they agree that the United States is not as in strong position as they were in the previous decades in regards to China, for example. So now we are structurally getting closer to the similar position, where we have institutions that we established through the previous decades which more or less satisfy us. We disagree on some portion of these institutions of the 90s and 2000s. And we both try to accommodate the rising powers And we both, in the process of accommodation, are trying to protect some of our interests. But now we are doing it in kind of competitive context, right? We are there is a kind of race between Russia and the U.S. regarding these rising powers, and who will provide them with better conditions. So, from my perspective, this could lead to at least the need to think that maybe by kind of agreeing together how we could together accommodate this rise of the rising powers, we could bargaining together better conditions, and we could increase our bargaining power by doing this from this perspective. I probably, as I said, provided a very provocative representation, and of course it runs very much against the current trends and the current particular problems in Russian-American relations that we are facing. Most of which, or some of which, are related to other areas that I haven't discussed in what I've presented. But I think it is also important to try to look at the bigger picture, not only to be overcome by specific crises and the context. And I'm fully aware that it is the proposition that I am making, that the restoring power and the currently dominating power could be closer in terms of their approaches to the global order than the emerging power with them. So I will be happy to take your criticism, disagreements, shouting against me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I will allow myself the privilege of posing the first response and question before we open it up to the room. I just realized as you were concluding why it is I find your writing so reasonable. It's because I agree with all of them. And naturally I think of myself as a reasonable person as well. But let me ask one question wrapped around a couple of thoughts. The first is that I really like the idea of this recovering power. It reminded me a bit of this quote, which I couldn't quite track down, so I asked Julie, wrote her a little note. It was Gorchakov, this lovely quote from late 19th century, I think, but equally apt at describing the 1990s and early 2000s. Russia is not sulking, she is collecting herself. So this particular moment of weakness, perhaps misidentified by US policymakers as a permanent moment of weakness. So here's my question, and then I'm going to tell you the thing that you said that offended me most. So my question is, do you think it was a tactical mistake by the United States to press that moment of advantage when Russia was collecting herself, to use the phrase? This collecting herself phrase fits very nicely with your restored power, right? That there would be a moment when the restoration, as it were, would come. Was it a tactical mistake to push that moment of weakness to an equilibrium that the United States is unable to maintain? Or could it be argued, on the other side, that that U.S. policy pushed that so far that, in fact, although Russia can resist on the margins, there's a kind of semi-permanent new equilibrium for the next little while that is difficult for a restored power like Russia to push back against. Although, either way, there's a kind of frustrating, inevitable patina to the conflict. And then I'll tell you the thing that I found too provocative and offensive, if I may, which is that you dared to quote the national security strategy of the United States, which, as you well know, is, as a piece of analysis, a deep embarrassment to this country. And so I don't think that's really quite fair. It's really a sad state of affairs that that's the official grand strategy doctrine of the United States. So I don't think it's reasonable to attribute it to, thoughtful people in the United States who consider these things. And if I could just conclude by observing that the United States is not collecting herself. She is sulking at the moment.
May I not comment for the last piece about the internal dynamic within the United States, but frankly, I think regarding the strategy of the United States and what it's doing, I think many would claim outside of the United States that this strategy demonstrates more openly some of the trends that existed in the U.S. foreign policy even before the current president came to power. So if you look at the patterns, and we discussed it in the talks with the students, if you look at the patterns, for example, in military sphere, the United States Army and the United States military started to look much more carefully about the advancement of other major powers earlier than this doctrine emerged. And in nuclear area, there were also some advancements before this wonderful document of February 2008.
That's fair, yes.
Emerged. So I would say that I think it is not related to that. And if you look at the expert discourse of very knowledgeable people, many of whom coming from this university, and many of those who come to this university, they started to talk about great power or major power or important, whatever you call it, you know, competition, rivalry. You could also use different terms quite for some time already. So I think that, I mean, this idea that we are in qualitatively different age in terms of relations between major states and the international system is a fair consideration, and we cannot close our eyes from that. And to what extent the document that we both mentioned reflects this is not my position to comment. Okay. I mean, what you said about this dilemma, whether there was tactical mistake of the U.S. and whether at the same time, or it is that the U.S. created facts on the ground which cannot be changed. I think it once again it's necessarily mutually exclusive. I think in Moscow, frankly, I'm an irresponsible academic, so I can speak my mind, right? So I think that no one expects so far NATO to roll back anytime soon, and not to have countries of Central and Eastern Europe back as non-NATO states, and there is appreciation of this understanding of that. But this created also certain resentment, which was fostered by other developments in the U.S. policy, and which continue to be reinforced by the developments in terms of the military deployment in Central and Eastern Europe, and in regards to Ukraine and other situations. So I think that that if you basically the question that you ask, if we press any further, will it increase the backlash? And I think it will increase substantially, and it will be a very different situation than we have even right now. Because of what I've said, I think it is not necessarily the rapprochement with Russia will require from the United States to get rid of all its gains that it got in the 90s and over the 2000s. So I think this is also could be a good news for the American decision makers, right? But how? Yeah, maybe I think.
That's great. Thank you. Would you like to?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, please.